Okay, so last week we started looking at Parak Daled, which is Nebuchadnezzar's second dream, where he sees this great tree, which is literally a tree over the whole world, almost animals under its shade, fruits are provided, sustenance, etc. And then he sees a malach come and cut the tree down to its stump, and its heart of man transformed into a heart of beast, and spends 7 seasons literally living as, I'm just scrolling back to find where I'm up to, literally living as a beast of the field until after 7 seasons, it kind of recognizes that ultimately God is the master of all kingdoms, and God can give rain or Libola Enosh Yishanu Pasuk Yud Gimel, his heart should be changed to a man, from a heart of man, V'lev Chaya Yinaten Lo, and transformed into a heart of a beast for 7 seasons, V'shiva Moadim Yachlufu Alav. And then all of this is because of the need for him to recognize that ultimately Sholet Ha'elyon B'malchut Enosh, God reigns over kingdoms of man, Ulemi Sheyirtzei Yitnena, and God will give it to whomever he wills, Ushfal Anashim Yakim Aleh, and even the lowest of man he can set up over others, and ultimately it's a matter of humility to recognize God's dominion. That's the dream, and that's what Nebuchadnezzar describes as the dream. And of course, its resolution is fairly straightforward, that everybody is afraid to tell the king what it means until Daniel comes in, and Daniel tells the king exactly what he understood was the answer to this resolution of this dream. Pitrono al Yibalucha, this is the story. He says, Eilana Sharaita, this tree that you saw up to the heavens and over the whole earth, this of course is the king, Atahu HaMelech. This is you, the king, this is your greatness, this is your power, all the way up to the heavens and to the ends of the earth. And as far as the Malach, the angel who came down and said that to cut this tree down to size, this is because, and here we get to the key piece of it, that in fact, this you will be sort of Malach v'kadosh yored min hashamayim v'mer gozu elan. That's what you saw. This Malach come and say, cut him down into a stump and then tie him in irons, and that will until 7 seasons will pass. That is what will happen to you, O king. You shall be banished from human civilization. You shall live with the animals of the field. You will eat grass like the animals. You will drink of the water of the dew for 7 seasons. Until you learn that God has dominion over man, and that ultimately God will give dominion to whomever he pleases. Then Daniel inserts a qualification. There's, as far as the stump is and the roots of the tree, that's because you have the option, the ability to return. Hamalchut lecha kayemet, the kingdom is still intact, and you can return to it. And therefore Nebuchadnezzar is given an Eitzah, El HaMelech etzati titav elecha, this is my advice to you, Chate'echa b'tzedakah p'dei, as far as iniquities, you can redeem them through giving charity, giving tzedakah. Avonatcha b'chon aniyim, your sins through mercy you can redeem. Im tiyar kala shalvatecha, and that will bring you length for your prosperity. Hakol higiel Nebuchadnezzar melech. This all transpired as was predicted. Okay, that's I think more or less where we got up to last week. We spent some time talking about the shock of the people in his kingdom. Why is Daniel afraid of the conversation with the Melech? And then ultimately, it is necessary for Nebuchadnezzar to have the courage to be able to say to the king, this is what is predicted. And the mystery of why he gives him an eitz, he gives him a suggestion as to how to avoid this punishment, that's more or less where the Mefarshim pick up onto the question of what is Daniel doing, and part of that is the next pasuk. The Ketz Yurachim Shnei Masar, at the end of 12 months, Al Hechala Malchut Bavel Mehalechaya, Nebuchadnezzar was walking over the top of his palace on the rooftop, looking down on his kingdom, and he proclaimed, Halozohi Bavel Hagdola. This is the great Babel. Asherani beniti elevet malchut betokev chosni lechvod adari, that I built with the strength of my hand and for the glory of my majesty. Od davar b'fi melech, the words had not yet departed from the king's mouth when kol min shamayim nafal. So I'm not quite sure why there's a crackling. Does anybody else hear the crackling?
Yes, I hear it too. I was wondering if there's something wrong with my speaker, but I guess I'm glad it's your end and not in mine.
Yeah, no, I think there's a, give me 1 second. I want to see if I can fix something. Not sure what's going on. Okay, well, we're just going to have to work with it for now, because I don't know what it is. A voice came out from the heavens and said, this kingdom has now been taken away from you. So whatever Eitzah Daniel gave him only worked for a limited period of time, namely 12 months. Because after that 12 months, exactly what was predicted in the dream transpires. And so part of the question as to what Daniel was trying to achieve is the question of why it only lasts for 12 months. Why is it only effective for 12 months? Was that intentional? Was it a temporary delay, or was it a permanent? Or was Daniel's suggestion that tzedakah can somehow mitigate the decree something which was open-ended, but Nebuchadnezzar fell short of it? More or less, if you take a quick glance, we'll come back to this in a second. If you take a quick glance at the Medrash Tanchuma, and the Medrash Tanchuma has a whole introduction in which he describes how essentially the message of the king of the dream was that because of Nebuchadnezzar's arrogance, he would be punished, and the resolution, as Daniel suggests, it is a sense of charity, a sense of chesed, a sense of tzedakah, in order to balance the humility that would balance out this the arrogance that was the sort of the intuition of the dream. If the purpose of the dream was to teach teach Nebuchadnezzar humility, if Nebuchadnezzar would embrace that humility on his own, he would avoid the decree of the dream. That's essentially how the solution works. However, miyad patach otov ashar tzvatav, so the solution was to open up the storehouses of the king and distribute their contents, v'chilek l'shneimasa chodesh, and he began to distribute to all of the poor people for 12 months. Says the Medrash, la'achar shneimasa chodesh, after 12 months, shechach oto rashat hachalom. Nebuchadnezzar forgot about the dream. He began to walk on the top of his palace, and he began to look out, and he heard some people crying, tzakata aniyim. He saw poor people crying out before his warehouses, and he said to his servants, what is the sound that I hear? And they said, well, these are the poor people that are demanding their food. And immediately the sense of stinginess overwhelmed him. Miyad nichnas ba'ayin va'ah. And he said, and he proclaimed this pasuk that we just read, Haladoi Bavel Rabta de Ana Banite Lebet Malchu Bitkaf Chisni Likar Hadri. That's the original Aramaic. Robert, that's for you. So the king said, is this not my Bavel that I built from my hands? And he literally, Amalo Kadosh Baruch Hu Washa, Migaram Lachashalva, Kolatan Shneimasa Chodesh. These last 12 months, you had tranquility and peace and quiet. You didn't have the tumult of the stream. It's not because of you. It's because of the tzedakah. If you take it back, then immediately the decree of the dream will be inserted. And that's essentially one way of looking at the story, which is that this was an attempt to mitigate the decree itself, this dream, open-ended, as long as he was willing to learn that humility on his own. The other way to look at it, yeah. Somebody have a question?
I ask you about the tzedakah part. That that he didn't learn the lesson of tzedakah, that everything comes from Hashem, and that by being merciful to everybody, that's the whole point.
Yeah, that's Daniel's attempt to kind of mitigate the dream by having him learn that lesson, but it has to be open-ended. It has to be permanent. He has to transform by limiting it to 12 months. What the Medrash is saying is that was on Nebuchadnezzar. The Nebuchadnezzar failed to learn that lesson.
Right?
The other way to look at it, which is how the Malbim suggests, is that from the outset, this was a short-term solution, because ultimately the message of the dream is fundamental to the story of Nebuchadnezzar, and ultimately nothing Nebuchadnezzar can do, it will mitigate that forever. The Malbim makes this statement that says, "Ikar haketzef haya alav al hatzelem she'asa," that primarily the purpose of this dream was a response of God's anger to the statue that he made in chapter 3. The Malbim does, which is very creative, is to look at the sequence of the chapters 2, 3, and 4 as all part of one sweep. And so the message of chapter 2 was the dream of the 4 kingdoms, was essentially that the kingdom of Bavel as an empire was limited, and it would be one day replaced. And Nebuchadnezzar's statue that he made in chapter 3, 60 cubits high, etc., we talked about, was Nebuchadnezzar's way of saying, no, I'm going to last forever. He wanted to eliminate or to cancel that decree in historical terms by saying, oh, no, I'm going to be forever. I'm entirely made of gold, not just the head. And to cancel the dream of the 4 kingdoms. Therefore, that's why he was punished. And his own personal kingdom, not just the kingdom as a whole, not just Malchut Bavel, but even his own kingdom, Malchut Nebuchadnezzar, was canceled takef immediately. So that man would know that he doesn't have the ability to change or transform the decree of God. And that ultimately this was the message that Nebuchadnezzar needed to understand and convey through this letter to his people, that ultimately God will determine who reigns. And if he tries to undo the gezerah, the kingdoms, what ends up happening is much worse. Because what ends up happening is that his own personal kingdom, Malchuto, Takef, is immediately removed from him, not just the kingdom of not just the empire, but even himself, Nebuchadnezzar, can be removed from the throne. So from that perspective, you could argue that even if he had wanted to mitigate this decree, some suggest that Daniel, in fact, Gemara suggests that Daniel hadn't kind of sinned in a way by suggesting this Eitzah to Nebuchadnezzar, but ultimately this is something which has to happen in order to teach Nebuchadnezzar this lesson. What I really want to talk about is, maybe we'll read the end of the parak. Let's read it through to the end so we get the whole story, and then I want to come back to 2 points. One is, what is this lesson, and how does this story teach Nebuchadnezzar this lesson? And number 2, what actually happened to Nebuchadnezzar? Those are the 2 questions remaining in this chapter. Well, the words were still in the king's mouth when he made this proclamation that this is my Bavel. Voice came from heaven and said, to you, Nebuchadnezzar, I tell you, this kingdom has now been removed from you. That's what the Malbim is referring to. You shall be banished from civilization. And you shall dwell with the beasts of the field. They will feed you grass. And 7 seasons shall pass. Until you know or learn, God rules over the kingdom of man, and to whom he wishes, he shall give it. Remember this phrase, I want to come back to it in a few minutes. Babisha, at that moment, Hadavar Kalal Nebuchadnezzar, this matter was fulfilled in Nebuchadnezzar. Me'enosh Gorash was driven from man. Esav Kashvarim Yochal, he ate grass as ox. Esav Mitala Shemayim Gufo Yitabel, and he would bathe in the dew of the heavens. Ad Shesaro Kanesharim Gadal, till his hair grew and Tziponim Katziporim, Vitzipanav Katziporim, and his nails grew. The 7 years he lived as a beast of the field. Uleketz Hayamin, at the end of this time, right, the 7 seasons, Ani Nebuchadnezzar, notice the shift to first person again. Einai l'shamayim nasati, I lifted up my eyes to the heavens. Vidati alai tashuv, and my awareness, my knowledge returned to me. Ve'et ha'elyon berachti, till I praised, blessed the one on high. Ve'et chai ha'olam, the one who endures forever. Shibachti ufe'arti, I praised and gave glory. Asher shiltono shilton olam, recognizing that his kingdom is eternal. Umalchuto im dor vador, and his kingdom reigns from generation to generation. B'chol darei haaretz, and now he's kind of turning to the inhabitants of the world. B'chol darei haaretz ka'ayin chashuvim, all of the inhabitants of the world are nothing compared to him. Mikirtzono se b'chel hashamayim v'darei haaretz, and he acts in according to his will, in his decrees, in the heavens and on the earth. There's none who can challenge him. There's none who can change his will. And to say to God, what are you doing? I think differently. No, that's not possible. And Nebuchadnezzar learned that lesson himself. At the moment that my understanding returned to me, Likar malchuti adari v'zivi yeshuvei, and my majesty, my splendor returned to me. My minister, my glory, my light, returned to me. V'oti yoatzai v'sarai yivakshu, my ministers and officers sought me; they were looking for me. Ve'amalchuti ochanti, I was returned to my kingdom. Ugdula yitera nosfali, I even had more greatness than I had before. Ani Nebuchadnezzar, this is, he's finishing the letter. I, Nebuchadnezzar, mishabeach umramemu fa'eret hamelech hashemayim, I praise the King of heaven. Asher kol ma'asav emet v'orchatav mishpat, all of his deeds are true, his ways are just. Asher malchim begava yochol lashpil, and anybody who walks in arrogance, namely himself, he is able to put low. And that's essentially the story of Nebuchadnezzar learning the very powerful and very intense lesson of humility. That's the end of the story of Nebuchadnezzar. I will give you one clue as to Perek Hey. Perek Hey begins Belshazzar. Belshazzar is 2 kings later after Nebuchadnezzar.
Right.
So this really is the end of what we know about in terms of Tanakh of Nebuchadnezzar. Somebody had a question? There's lots of questions, but somebody wanted to come. Okay.
Question, is it a dream?
Oh, that's one of those questions. Is what exactly happens to him? Sorry, I'm just gonna, for a second, there's a little bit of background noise. I'm gonna put on mute again and see what happens. But the big question is what actually happened to Nebuchadnezzar? Was it a dream? Did he actually transform? Did he physically transform, emotionally transform? That is the big question. Given the fact that we have a lot to accomplish, let me start with that question. I was going to actually do it last, but we might as well do it first. Let me start with that question. That's a big machloket in the Mefarshim. If you take a look at the source page, I do not know why. 1 second. Let's do this again. Sorry, we're just having a little bit of technical stuff. We're going to address it right now. Okay, back to share screen. Okay. That's a very famous picture of Nebuchadnezzar living as a beast of the field for 7 years, for a painting by William Blake. If anybody wants, you can find it on Wikipedia. Not hard. All right. I just thought I'd throw that in there for a little bit of kind of get a visual picture. It's nothing is as good as a visual picture. Tanakh doesn't have pictures. Tanakh only has words. The pictures we can draw in our minds. So there's several possible explanations to what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. Is the whole thing a dream? That's one possibility. He's kind of describing it in a letter. But the way it's described, where he's walking, he says he's walking on the top of his palace in 12 months, and he looks down at Babel and he makes his proclamation, and boom, out of the heavens proclaims this voice that says, "Oh, you did it. You crossed the line. I warned you about this. And now you're going to live for 7 seasons as a beast of the field." Unclear that is, in fact, whether it's a dream or whether it actually takes place. We don't know. There is an Ibn Ezra, a very famous Ibn Ezra, who makes the following explanation. I apologize for not having a translation of it. I looked high and low, but I'm going to translate as we go. He says, Al yaleh libcha shenebuchadnezzar shav behema zachar or nekeba. Don't imagine for a moment, don't think that Nebuchadnezzar was physically transformed into a beast, male or female. It doesn't mean that he was literally like in the movies, you wave the magic wand and you transform him into a frog or into a beast, right? That's not what we're dealing with. We're not dealing with magic. Doesn't say he was transformed. It says he would live as a beast. He would live amongst the animals, and he would eat grass like the animals. If you take away the wisdom, the self-awareness of the soul, then what remains is the heart and the mind of an animal. And proof is that at the end, he's able to look to the heavens and restore his awareness. That's what he says. Then Ibn Ezra says, I'll tell you a story. One of our friends, trustworthy friend, he gidli, told me, there was in some island, Shehi Sardanya, there was some Gentile there, Yatsau Barach Me'avotav, who ran away from his fathers, ran away from his family. Kisara Da'ato, kind of went crazy. Vishtagea. Ve'ayayim ayalim, and he lived with the animals, he lived with the deers, he lived with the gazelles. For 12 months, for many years, Shanim Rabot. He used to walk on his feet, he would walk on all fours. Come on, he lived like an animal. What has been known in the literature is the kind of the mythology of the feral child, right? The child raised by wolves, or in this case, raised by gazelles. The king of this island went to hunt, and in his mistaking this child for a gazelle, the king thought that he was an animal, caught him, and brought him back to his palace. His parents came, and they recognized him. They spoke to him. He couldn't answer them because he was living as an animal. They gave him wine, they gave him food, but he didn't want. He couldn't handle it. They gave him grass together with the gazelles, and then he ate. But in the middle of the night, he ran away and he ran back to the fields. So the Ibn Ezra tells this story of this feral child, this child who grows up amongst the gazelles, as a kind of a first-hand testimony that such things can happen, right? We're all familiar with the story of the Jungle Book, right? The Jungle Book was made out of these kinds of stories. Now, it's fascinating to me that the Ibn Ezra quotes this as a first-hand testimony from a friend of his. Why is it fascinating? Because I went searching for where this story could possibly have originated from, and I found a very interesting source there is in the, and you can read it in Wikipedia. Wikipedia is not necessarily an academic source, but it's pretty accurate for these kinds of things. There is a 12th century Spanish Muslim philosopher, more or less contemporary of the Ibn Ezra, by the name of Ibn Tufayl, who wrote a story. And the story was about philosophy. The story was called Chai bin Yakzan. I'm not sure what the Arabic is, alive, son of awake. And he tells this story. Here's the Wikipedia version of it. And the story is about a child. The story revolves around the Chai ibn Yakzan, a little boy who grew up in the island in the Indies, under the equator, isolated from the people, in the bosom of an antelope that raised him, feeding him with her milk. And that he was just learned to walk, and he imitates the sounds of the antelopes and the birds and other animals. And eventually he learns their language, and he learns to follow their actions by instinct. And he makes his own shoes, and he makes his own clothes, and he reaches a higher level of knowledge of the finest astrologists and philosophers. Now, he's writing this as a philosopher, and it's quoted by Maimonides in the Guide to the Perplexed. It's quoted by other sources because it's a testimony to philosophy and to the ability of the human mind to develop an awareness of philosophical treatises, even without education. It's a fascinating story. But it's quite possible that the Ibn Ezra is kind of aware of that story and borrows it and integrates it into this testimony that such things can happen. And that's more or less how the Ibn Ezra saw the story of Nebuchadnezzar. It's kind of transformed into one of these people who now live in the forest and live with the beasts of the field. All because of the decree of God to teach him the lesson of humility. After 7 seasons, he raised as a child by living amongst the animals. Nothing would teach you humility more than that. So says the Ibn Ezra. A slight variation on a theme is the Malbim. And the Malbim takes the approach that starts with the following. He says, obviously, there was some tradition that people who interpreted the story that he literally was transformed into a beast. He says that's not possible. In other words, he didn't look like an animal. He didn't look like a cow. He looked like Nebuchadnezzar, just with long hair and nails and long nails. Because if he was literally transformed, how it disappeared one day, right? He asks the question, why didn't anybody go looking for him? They're assuming that he died or something, right? Where is he? This is exactly what Daniel explained. Namely, you would be banished from civilization. Now listen to his insight. This is very powerful. He says Nebuchadnezzar was overwhelmed by some kind of mental illness, whether it be depression or melancholy or some black cloud that hovered over his awareness. Which extraordinarily, even more than usual. To the point when Nebuchadnezzar could not handle human company anymore. And he ran away to be alone, isolated, to live as a hermit, to live in the forest, to live isolated from the rest of civilization. And to live in the desert, to live in the forest, and to live alone, to live the life of a hermit. And therefore to eat of the grass, in other words, says the Malbim, unlike the Ibn Ezra, he's not being transformed in some way supernaturally, but rather he's kind of, his mental state had reached the point where he abandons the palace and he abandons civilization and he goes into this isolation to live alone in the field, in the forest, to live and without the amenities of civilization. And so everything darkens, his nails grow and his hair grows, he's living in isolation. And all of this continues until after 7 seasons, everybody saw him, they knew where he was, it wasn't like he had died. He wasn't forgotten. He wasn't removed, dethroned. They were just wondering, when is he going to get over this and come back? So for some period of time, he says his son must have taken over the kingdom in his stead for those 7 years. We'll talk about that in a second. So more or less, both the Ibn Ezra and the Malbim take the approach that this isn't a dream. Something happened to Nebuchadnezzar. Something triggered in Nebuchadnezzar, whether externally or internally, and whether he was transformed and therefore ran to the field, or whether he ran to the field because he was kind of so depressed or so kind of distanced from civilization, so disgusted by what he was experiencing in the palace, whatever the circumstances were, and he literally runs and lives in isolation for 7 years until he heals himself from that experience. A similar kind of approach to the Malbim is taken with a little bit of a different twist. There's a series of midrashim that say that Nebuchadnezzar began to go crazy. There's one medrash that says that he was sitting with Tzidkiyahu, having dinner with Tzidkiyahu. He invited Tzidkiyahu to a meal, and as Tzidkiyahu is sitting there, Nebuchadnezzar begins to eat, and Riro Yored al Zkano, and he began to dribble, his spittle running down his beard. Tzidkiyahu is looking at him, eating like an animal. And he looks in astonishment. He says, is this the one the whole world is subjugated to, this crazy person, right? This Nebuchadnezzar? And Nebuchadnezzar continues in the Medrash, and Medrash Tanachum, and Nebuchadnezzar takes an oath. We swear to me that you won't reveal this. And so he swears, and Nebuchadnezzar runs away. So all of these take the approach that there is some kind of emotional transformation that takes place in Nebuchadnezzar's mind that ultimately leads Nebuchadnezzar to run into the field or to be banished to the fields and to live as a beast for 7 years to teach him this lesson of humility. There is a slightly different approach that is alluded to in the Medrash in a different set of sources. And, there's a history. If you take a look at Wikipedia, there's this reference to a Babylonian leader, queen, by the name of Shmuramat. Who she was is unclear, but you can read this on your own, right? It's a reference in Wikipedia. I put it at the reference in the source book, in the source page. Who the Shmuramat is, some kind of Babylonian monarch who reigns for a period of time, when and where, unclear. But the Medrash is aware of the name, and the Medrash makes the following statement. In Esther Rabbah, there are a number of instances in Tanakh, says the Medrash, of Nashim Mashluba, of women who ruled in the kingdoms. And the Medrash says, Arba Nashim Natlu Memshala Ba'olam, there are 4 women who reigned in the world in Tanakh, and these are they, Ve'eluhain, Izebel va'Ataya miYisrael, Izebel and Ataya, both stories in Tanakh. Izebel, wife of Achav, Ataya, daughter or granddaughter of Achav and Izebel, who kills the royal family, takes over the kingdom. And Vashti is the 4th, right, in Megillat Esther. And the 3rd is Shmiramit. And again, it's unclear who Shmiramit is. However, the possibility of the reference here, these are all stories in Tanakh, the reference here could be that there's a 7-year coup taking place in the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. In other words, what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, whether he goes crazy, or whether he kind of loses his mind, or some sort of a mental illness or something overwhelms him, but he gets removed from the throne. And during those 7 years, says the Medrash, Shmiramit is in charge. Shmiramit, Nebuchadnezzar's wife, according to the Medrash, Shmiramit is Nebuchadnezzar's wife. Whether that matches historically or not is unclear. But so in his stead, they took his son, Evil Merodach, and he became the regent. He became the king in Nebuchadnezzar's stead. The Kivan Shechazar, when Nebuchadnezzar came back after 7 years, they went and they put Nebuchadnezzar and put Evil Merudach in jail. In other words, when Nebuchadnezzar came back, the text describes him having more power than he had before he was banished. So he saw that there was an attempted coup on his reign. He comes back after 7 years of the fury. He takes Evil Merudach, who had been sitting on his throne as a regent, and he throws him into jail. And everybody knows that anybody who enters into the jail of Nebuchadnezzar never emerged from it. However, once Nebuchadnezzar died, Kivan Shemet, so they came back to Evil Merudach and they said, okay, so now you be king. I'm not listening to you. I originally listened, you told me that Nebuchadnezzar was gone. So I took over the throne. Then Nebuchadnezzar came back. He threw me into jail. Now I'll come back. Nebuchadnezzar is hiding. He's going to kill me. They wouldn't believe him. He wouldn't believe them that Nebuchadnezzar had actually died. Until they literally took the body of Nebuchadnezzar and they showed him the dead body of Nebuchadnezzar to demonstrate that in fact Nebuchadnezzar had died, and this time Evil Merudach was taken and placed on the throne. Why this is relevant is interesting. It's not relevant to this parak. It's just interesting that the Medrash depicts Nebuchadnezzar, Evil Merudach, is sitting in jail under Nebuchadnezzar. That's just an interesting aside, because in the jails of Nebuchadnezzar, there's another king. Anybody know who the other king is in the jails of Nebuchadnezzar? You want to venture a guess? Who's sitting in the jails of Nebuchadnezzar?
The king of Judah.
The king of Judah, by the name of Yehoiachin. So it's entirely possible that this medrash was created in order for us to find a contact point between Evil Merudach and Yehoiachin. Sitting in there in that jail, he meets a Jewish king and he befriends him. Why is that important? We know very little about the Evil Merudach. All we know is that he's the king in between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. Reigns for about 20 some odd years. We know nothing about him. He's not mentioned in Tanakh in a lot of places. We only have one little reference to him in Tanakh. The one reference to him we have in Tanakh is at the end of the Book of Kings. The very end of the Book of Kings, the last chapter, we have the destruction. Nebuchadnezzar destroys the temple, and he burns the temple. Nebuzaradan is general, and all the people go into exile, and the kingdom is destroyed, and that's the end of Sefer Malachim. And then it says, there's a jump from the exile of the people to, and people go down to Mitzrayim. There's a jump forward in time. At the end of 37 years of exile of Yehoiachin Melech Yehuda, in the 12th year, in the 27th, B'Shneimasa Chodesh, the 12th month, B'Sivim Chodesh, Nasa Evil Merudach Melech Bavel Bishnat Malcho. Evil Merudach, the king of Bavel, the year that he becomes the king, that he takes over the throne, he frees Yehoiachin from jail, and he sees at Rosh Yehoiachin Melech Yehuda mi Bet HaKela. And he speaks to him kindly, and he gives him a position of stature, and he says, this is my friend, this is a person of honor. The king of Judah is now going to sit next to the king of Bavel in the throne in the palace of Bavel. Shinet Bekadav, he changed his clothes from the clothes of jail, and he ate bread with the king all these years. Right. So the only thing we know about Evil Merudach is that he finally redeems Yehoiachin from jail and places him on a position of honor, and he says, you are in a position of dignity. That's the only thing we know about him. So there is this medrash that says that contact between Evil Merudach occurred during those 7, when Evil Merudach was in jail. And he was in jail because he was the one who they turned to when Nebuchadnezzar kind of went into this period of 7 years of absence. So they put Nebuchadnezzar on the throne. When Nebuchadnezzar came back, he threw Nebuchadnezzar in jail. But that has a divine providence role, because there in jail he meets Yoyachin and they become close friends. And ultimately, years later, he was able to free Nebuchadnezzar from free Yoyachin from jail. So that's a fascinating piece of the story of how it happened. So whether you take, I'm just going to kind of scan out here for a second, whether you take the approach of the Eben Ezra or you take the approach of the Malbim, whether he kind of, God transforms his heart into the heart of a beast and he goes and he runs and lives like an animal, like a feral child for 7 years. Or the Malbim says he was kind of overwhelmed by a mental illness and he goes and he runs from civilization and he lives as a isolation, as a hermit in the forest for 7 years. Or the approach of the Medrash that he literally comes overwhelmed by some sort of mental illness. Or the approach of the Medrash Rabbah that there's some sort of coup, an attempt to kind of bring Nebuchadnezzar out of favor, and Nebuchadnezzar is forced into exile, and then he comes back. However you look at it, at the end of the day, the core message of all of these examples is what the story is about, which is to teach Nebuchadnezzar one fundamental lesson. And that's really what I wanted to kind of bring us to the last piece of today's shir with. What is the core message that this entire parak is designed to teach Nebuchadnezzar? Key piece of the story.
Hashem is in control.
Hashem is in control. Let's fine tune it. Hashem is in control, and therefore,
man's role is temporary.
okay, but we're talking about kingdoms. We're talking about reigns.
Right, reigns are temporary. He's not going to be there forever.
And who controls who reigns?
Hashem.
God, right. That's a key piece. And I'll show it to you in 4 different references. I want to look at this phrase very carefully. In Pasuk Yudalid, when Nebuchadnezzar is describing the dream to Daniel, and he says, "B'gizrat malachim adavar." This is by decree of the angels. Al tivrat sheyedu hachayim, so that the living should know, ki sholet ha'elyon b'malchut enosh, that God reigns over the kingdom of man. Ulemi sheyirtzeh yitnena, and to whom he wills it, he will give dominion. Okay, keep that phrase in mind. Let's jump to Pasuk Chaf Bet. Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, you shall be exiled from human civilization, and you will live like a beast of the field for 7 years, or 7 seasons, Shiva Moadim. Ad sheteda, until you learn, Ki sholet elyon b'malchut enosh, God reigns over the kingdom of man, ulemi sheyirtzeh yitnena, and to whom he wishes, he will give that dominion. Also Chavtet. The Malach comes from heaven, the word comes from on high, because Nebuchadnezzar has violated his commitment of tzedakah. He said, this is an arrogance. Enosh otcha megashim, we're going to banish you from civilization, chayat habar medacha, etc., etc. Ad sheteda, until you learn, yisholet elyon b'malchut enosh u'b'mi sheyirtzeh yitnena, that God will give dominion to whomever he pleases or he wishes. And at the end of the letter that Nebuchadnezzar is writing, he says explicitly this lesson that he learned, Kol darei haaretz ka'ayin chashuvim, the inhabitants of the world are like nothing. And God does, in accordance with his will, to place dominion in the heavens and on earth. And nobody can challenge him. Now, for Nebuchadnezzar, this is an extraordinarily important lesson. It's the key phrase that runs through the entire parak. So ultimately, what physically happened to Nebuchadnezzar is less the significant question here, as much as the takeaway for Nebuchadnezzar. What did he learn from this experience? Whether it be a coup in his kingdom, or whether it be a divine transformation of his being, or whether it be some sort of mental state that transforms, that overwhelms him. What did he learn from it? He learned one lesson, that ultimately dominion is given by God, and God can give it to whomever he chooses. L'mishe yirtzeh. Why do I emphasize that phrase? Number one, because it appears in this parak 4 times. But number 2 is because it's the key to unlocking the purpose of the whole story. Meaning, and for this, we're going to go back to a chapter in Yirmiyahu. Chapter in Yirmiyahu, very famous story. Not Yoyakim, it's Tzidkiyahu. Yirmiyahu is sent to a group of very powerful leaders of all of the region in their plotting and planning of the rebellion against, and this is before the Churban, this is the early years, in the planning of the Churban, planning of the rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar, as Nebuchadnezzar comes to power. And God sends Yirmiyahu to the people with a message not to rebel against Nebuchadnezzar. God says to Yirmiyahu, I want you to make kind of a yoke with bars made out of wood and place them on your neck. And then you're going to send these kinds of yokes to each of these kings, king of Edom, king of Moab, king of Ammon, king of Tzor, and the king of Sidon, who have all gathered in Yerushalayim together with Tzidkiyahu Melech Yehuda. And you're going to instruct them as follows. Go tell them to go and say this to their masters. I have made the earth, and the man and the animals and that are on the face of the earth. I made everything with my power, my great power, my outstretched arm. And I have given that world and that dominion to whomever pleases me in my eyes. Says Yirmiyahu to Tzidkiyahu and to all of the kings of the region. Now I have given all of these kingdoms to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babel, my servant. Even the animals of the field I have made to serve Nebuchadnezzar. Because it pleases me, because at this moment in history, Yashar Be'enai means to give reign and dominion to Nebuchadnezzar. Enabling Nebuchadnezzar, described as Eved Hashem, the God's servant or God's messenger, enabling and empowering Nebuchadnezzar to go and conquer and destroy the temple, something which has never been done. And the people will serve, all these nations will serve Nebuchadnezzar and his son, Evil-Merodach, and his grandson, Belshazzar, until such time will come as Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, Adbo et Arzo Gamhu, until I will hold him accountable too, like the decree against Egypt. So it's fascinating to me. It's fascinating to me that the whole story of Nebuchadnezzar starts with this nevuah that Yirmiyahu expresses, namely that God has dominion, he can give it to whoever he wants. So who does he give dominion to at that moment in time? Tzidkiyahu, not to you, nations of Israel, not to you, but to Nebuchadnezzar, because God has decreed it so. But you understand the arrogance that Nebuchadnezzar takes away from that message. The arrogance is now Nebuchadnezzar. He's destroyed the temple. He's destroyed the God of Israel. He's destroyed gods. He's destroyed temples. He's in power. He's running the world. He's sitting at the top of an empire. And so the message to Nebuchadnezzar, the entire sequence of events from the beginning of the Sefer, chapter 2 with the dream, and chapter 3 Nebuchadnezzar's response to it, and chapter 4 God's second dream to him, and his second response to Nebuchadnezzar's response, is all a message articulated in one phrase. God gave dominion to you, Nebuchadnezzar, for a purpose, but as much as he's given you dominion, he can take it away. The arrogance that Nebuchadnezzar demonstrates is off the charts, unprecedented. And therefore, God says to him, I can't allow you, I can't enable you, empower you to remain in that arrogance. You need to understand, Nebuchadnezzar, that I gave you a mission, I gave you a purpose, but that doesn't make you the eternal God power of the world. At the core, that's the message of this whole sequence in chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 4. To teach Nebuchadnezzar the humility that he was so desperately needed to learn, because he understood his role to be this, I can destroy the temple. But that makes him almost in competition to God. God says no. We saw a little bit of this when we looked at this at chapter 14 in Yeshayahu. There's a nevuah to Bavel. We looked at this in chapter 3, where the message to the king of Bavel, "V'nasata mashal hazeh melech Bavel v'yamarta ech shavat noges shavta madeva." How was the oppressor ceased? The golden city ceased. Shavar Hashem mateh v'shem shevet moshlim. God has broken the staff of the wicked and the scepter of the ruler. Right. This is the nevuah against the king of Bavel as a way of saying to him, cut him down to size, because he has become so pompous that he needs to learn this sense of humility. Your pomp has to be brought down into the grave. And that's exactly the message of this parak. Or a similar context. In Yechezkel, it's a very interesting nevuah to the same context. What's fascinating about this nevuah of Yechezkel is that if I go back to the dream, what's the symbol of Nebuchadnezzar in this second dream? What structure is used to symbolize Nebuchadnezzar? A tree, right? Tree, a giant tree under whose shade the animals live, and in whose fruit the people bask, right? That is exactly that notion that the tree, the tall, powerful tree, like the cedars of Lebanon, Erez Lebanon, is a theme that the Nevi'im use all the time to describe the power of kings and the arrogance of kings. And so Yechezkel has an entire chapter where he's talking to the king of Mitzrayim, Paro, but in the same language. And he says to Paro, Melech Mitzrayim, and to all who is like him, right? Ami dimita begodlecha, to whom are you compared yourself in your greatness? Look at Ashur, look at Assyria, conquered by Bavel, in Ashur. They thought themselves Erez Balavanon, like a cedar of Lebanon. Yefei Anaf, beautiful branches, Choresh Mitzal, Ugva Koma, with forest-like shade and high stature. And its top was amongst the thick boughs of the heavens, like the clouds. Water nourished it, and it was deep and it was tall. That's how Ashur, that's how Assyria looked at itself. And therefore, because of its arrogance, Kavad Komato, over all of the other trees, what happened to it? Eventually, it was cut down. The cedars in the garden could not hide it. Right? Because you, God says to the king of Paro, have made yourself exalted and arrogant in this way. And your heart has been lifted up in arrogance. I will cut you down and deliver you into the hands of another nation. It will cut you down. I would say, Goyim, the trees of other nations will destroy you. And that's the message over and over again. You see this theme in Yechezkel, you see it in Yeshayahu, that ultimately the symbol of the tree is a symbol of arrogance, a symbol of power that the kings of the empires of old took upon themselves. And the message in this dream is very simple. It starts with Yirmiyahu's message to Tzidkiyahu. I'm appointing Nebuchadnezzar, my servant, Nebuchadnezzar Avdi. Nebuchadnezzar is going to serve my role for this period of time, for 3 generations, to exile the Jewish people and to destroy the temple because of their sins. But from that lesson to learn that they are in charge, that they are a kingdom of gold, that they are a tree made of the towers in the heavens, that they are a kingdom of soldier made of 60 cubits high, made of pure gold, and that no kingdom will ever replace Babel. So he has a dream that teaches him that the time period of Babel is 70 years and 3 generations and limited. Doesn't buy it. So he builds a statue of pure gold to combat the dream and say, no, I'm in charge. I'm the king of all gold. So God says, okay, you're not going to buy this in a dream. We're going to do this differently. And so he has a second dream where it's not the kingdom that ends, but Nebuchadnezzar, the king, who ends. And he gets transformed into the beast of the field. And then Daniel says to him, I beg you, a little humility, a little charity, a little chesed, a little kindness, and maybe you can avert this calamity. 12 months it lasts. And then he walks on the top of his palace and he says, oh, this is Babel I built. What do you mean you built? You built nothing. You built it because God let you build it. 7 years, coup in the palace, emotional state transformation, physical transformation, however you want to read it. Maybe it's a dream. I don't think it's a dream. I think it's actually something happened to him for those 7 years. Unable to function for those 7 years. And he finally comes crawling, literally crawling his way back into the palace. And eventually this table is now set for Nebuchadnezzar to end, for Fil Merudach to come to play, for Yoyachin to be freed from jail, and for the kingdom of Babel in its arrogance to kind of wane into the sideline as the potential and the hope and the expectation of the rising kingdom of Persia will enable them to replace Babel and to be a little friendlier to the Jews and ultimately enable them to return. That table is now set, or beginning to be set, as the Fil Merudach is identified in the context of the replacement of Nebuchadnezzar. Thank you for listening. I appreciate you tolerating my very hoarse voice. At this point, I ran through the end a little bit quicker than I would have otherwise, but it enables us to finish this unit in the 2 lessons that we had planned. Next week, B'ezrat Hashem, we start chapter 5 and the beginning of the story of Belshazzar. I will stop for a moment and take questions.
Can I just say something about Ibn Ezra and that book, that story? Ibn Ezra wrote the same book, Ibn Hai Ben Makitz, probably in Italy, and I think it was probably in Sardinia was the name, which is an island west of Italy. So right. It may have been parallel. It may have actually been parallel and not taken from it. He wrote it in Hebrew, the same title as the Arabic one, which is interesting.
Interesting. It's attributed to a different author, but it could be that he wrote, kind of borrowed it, rewrote it, or the other way around. Yeah. Yes, fascinating. But I think it's fascinating that he referenced this as a kind of a story that he heard about from a friend of his, which right,
because it's Sardinia would be next to Rome or Lucca, where he wrote his first commentary on Daniel. Right. That's what I meant. Yeah, thank you.
Fascinating. Thank you for sharing that.
Do you think the hanging of Haman and his 10 sons is the tree in which he was hanged echoes the one that is it parallel to the?
That's a really interesting question. It's not 6. It's 50 amot, not 60 amot. That's interesting too. Is there a parallel to the tree in which Haman was and his 10 sons were hanged? I have to think about that. We'll get to the reference to the intersection between Daniel and the story of Purim, but we'll get there a little bit later in the course.
Thank you.
Rabbi, after Nebuchadnezzar came back after the 7 years, did he reign again or no?
I'm assuming he describes his reign
how long?
as
Do we know?
We don't know, because we don't know when this takes place in that sequence.
Why is God sending this message? Well, what about Nebuchadnezzar is so special of all the non-Jewish kings out there that he deserves a prophet?
Right. No, 100%. That is a very powerful question. Actually, it's a question we addressed in our opening series on Nebuchadnezzar, or on the beginning of chapter 2. Why specifically Nebuchadnezzar? And really the only answer I can offer is that Nebuchadnezzar is the only king, certainly in Tanakh, who was given the context of destroying the temple. And the danger of that action, which is exactly how we see played out in Nebuchadnezzar, is the arrogance that, quote unquote, I killed God. We see it in the second temple in all the stories about Titus, right? That I killed God, I destroyed the temple. So there's an arrogance there and a potential danger that needed a balance. And that was necessary not only for Nebuchadnezzar, it was necessary for Israel. Because the potential, and a little bit we talked about this last week, where we talked about the fact that the people went through this, or a couple of weeks ago, the people went through this experience where they felt that the destruction of the temple and their exile was the end of their covenant with God. And all of these efforts, both to the message to Nebuchadnezzar as well as the Nevi'im to Israel, are kind of a two-pronged effort to enable the Jewish people to recover from all this experience, to see it as a part of a divine plan that will eventually lead them back, because the covenant with God is not over. That's part of the story of Purim. It's part of the story of Shivat Zion. It's part of the message of Yechezkel. And certainly I think that's what Daniel's message to Nebuchadnezzar is. God is still God. God is still the God of the Jewish people. That's that kingdom of the rock that he describes in the vision of the second dream and the first dream.
But why would they not need the message again after the destruction of the second temple?
Because they'd already learned it. That's exactly the point. And I don't know if you were in that class when we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but that's what's so powerful about it. The lesson, the notion that the destruction of the temple spelled the end of the covenant with God was the dangerous takeaway from the destruction of the first temple. It took all of the efforts of the Nevi'im. It took the entire experience of Bavel. It took the return of Bavel. It took the story of Purim. It will eventually take the story of Hanukkah to teach the Jewish people this lesson, that no matter what happens to them, the covenant is eternal. But once they learned that lesson, comes the second destruction of the second temple. They've got it. It's in their bones. They're inoculated. Somebody used the expression inoculated, right? They're inoculated from that argument. That's why when the second temple is destroyed and the effort in the development of the Hebrew Christians, which wanted to take the position that says that God had abandoned the covenant. Actually, it starts much later. That God has abandoned the covenant with Israel and gone somewhere else. Right? We weren't buying it, because we had been through that experience in the first temple and recognized that the covenant with God is eternal. So that lesson is so fundamental to this whole period of time of Tanakh. It's part of the underpinning of why there's this Daniel Nebuchadnezzar conversation. It's part of the message of Yechezkel to the people. It's part of the message of Yirmiyahu to the people that says to them, this is 70 years, this is temporary, you will be returning home. It's part of the message of Messianism, that the covenant with God is eternal no matter what happens. But it takes us the entire experience of exile, of the first destruction, to recognize that, to learn that, to internalize it so deeply that it becomes part of the consciousness of the Jewish people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Feel better.
Thank you. Appreciate your time. Appreciate you staying a few extra
very
minutes.
much.
Have a wonderful day or evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.